Good afternoon. The 15 minutes of fame. Try to drag this on a little so Zaki makes it on time. Zaki and I have a history. When I was with the government press office, he would represent some of the Arab media. He was never late for a Supreme Court appearance, I can tell you that. But anyway, first of all, thank you very much. I want to thank the Netanya College for the opportunity for the wonderful conference, the important conference, and also for the opportunity to speak as a representative of the government of Israel, the Ministry of Public Diplomacy and Diaspora Affairs. A few weeks ago, I was asked by Eli, what will be the topic of my speech here, or my few remarks? I said, I don't know. I'll know the moment I get on stage. But he was insistent because they needed to put it into the program. So I looked at the topic, balancing free speech and academic freedom with countering anti-Israeli activity. And I said to him, all right, הנה זקי הגיע. אמרתי, אני משכתי כדי שאתה תגיע. אמרתי להם, אתה לבית המשפט לא איחרת אף פעם. So now that we're all here, we can begin. So I said to him, it's around Christmas time, I said, yes, Virginia, you may criticize Israel. He said, I don't think most people will get it, so I just kept it at, yes, Israel may be criticized. And so everybody is sure that this is going to be a conversation on the fact that Israel may be criticized. And that's very short conversation or a few very short remarks. It won't be 15 minutes. Yes, Israel can be criticized, and I can step down and leave it at that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and because it's a given. I remember a few years ago, and Zaki's here, it's interesting because in 2007, when I was the director of the government press office, we took a group of diplomats and journalists to Dalit el-Carmel, and to expose to them the stories of minorities in Israel. And it so happened on that day was the day in which the Druze community was demonstrating in Jerusalem. And the deputy head of the municipality said to me in Hebrew, should I talk about this? I said, yeah, say everything. If I wasn't here today, I'd probably be joining them. And some of the diplomats had overheard that. I forgot that they speak Hebrew. And they came up later and they were very impressed by the fact that we allowed them to speak freely. And I mention this, not only so how wonderful and magnanimous we are, but simply for the reason that, I would have joined them in demonstrating because I, for one, believe that it's disgusting the way the country treats the Druze minority, among others, especially a minority that contributes so much to this society. And I would like all of you for a moment, just take a moment. I don't think we'll have to take too much of a moment, and think about any gripe that you may have with the state of Israel. I'm sure that there are many of them. Just open up the newspaper. I'm sure that most of us will agree that we were, in the very least, uncomfortable with the behavior of a particular commander last night, yesterday afternoon. And you can be critical of that. It's legitimate. Because this is the essence. To be critical of who we are and what we are and constantly ask questions is the essence of Judaism. It's the essence of the state of Israel. And let's not be too caught up with ourselves. It's very much the essence of a democracy, to be critical of yourself. People have a right to criticize Israel and its policies. What they do not have a right to do is to distort the facts, misrepresent events, and selectively apply international law and standards when referring to Israel. I wrote a very nice speech here. I'm sure you'll all be very impressed if I read it out to you, but I'd rather just speak from how I feel and not from something that I wrote down and thoughts that I had over the past few weeks. I had a problem with the topic. Why? For a simple reason. Since, as we've already established, we all know that you can be critical of the state of Israel and you can criticize the state of Israel, why is it, or let me address this from a different direction, you cannot balance free speech and academic freedom with countering anti-Israeli activity because these same people who are critical of the state of Israel constantly, that are professional criticizers of the state of Israel, do not allow freedom of speech and academic freedom and academic thought when referring to the issues. And the issue here is not that we who are so critical of ourselves are having a whole conference here. Show me one conference, and I'm not even talking about the Arab world at the moment. Show me among the liberal elite, the radical left, in Europe and in the United States, have they ever sat down and questioned themselves on their behavior and their standards and their attitude towards the state of Israel? I don't think there was a single conference. We're constantly nitpicking at ourselves, constantly looking at ourselves, checking ourselves, evaluating ourselves, which is fine. We should do that. But what we shouldn't be doing is constantly second questioning and doubting ourselves. Because when it comes down to it, people ask me all the time, you've been representing Israel for 30 years. How can you do it so long? How can you handle it? Why are you unapologetic? Because I honestly believe there's nothing to be apologetic about. We are fighting for our lives here. We're fighting for our survival. Are we perfect? No, not at all. We are not perfect. The expectation of perfection on the part of the state of Israel is a bias against the state of Israel. No country in the world is held to these standards. And we're damned if we do, damned if we don't. What do I mean by that? Very simple. We had a peace process. We were engaged in negotiations with our most horrible of enemies, with the PLO. At least that's what I was told back when I started working on behalf of Israel in 1983. We did not recognize the PLO at that time. And there were certain truths that we were told then. That if we recognize the Palestinian right to self-determination, there'll be peace. If we accept the PLO, the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, we'll have peace. If we dismantle settlements, there'll be peace. If we relinquish territory, there'll be peace. If we fulfill UN resolutions, there'll be peace. And over the past 30 years, some may not see it this way, you can see a progression on the Israeli part. Every one of these things are tried by the state of Israel. We relinquished territory, we dismantled settlements. Vis-a-vis Lebanon, we fulfilled every one of the UN resolutions. Recognize the PLO, recognize the Palestinian right to self-determination. Some of these people may see this as a validation of the liberal policies. I don't see it as a validation or not. We tried different things. We questioned ourselves. We took risks for peace. I remember the President of the United States telling us, take risks for peace. And we did that. Nobody can question the desire of the Israeli people, whether right wing or left wing. It's desire for peace. We all want it. But the people of Israel today are no longer talking about hypothetical or theoretical threats or dangers or risks for peace. We know exactly what the price is. And therefore, when Israel is questioned, and I said, damned if we do, damned if we do, here we had the peace process. And there were no roadblocks at the time. There was no barrier at the time. I grew up in Ashkelon. I remember traveling to Gaza, remember being a soldier in the reserves in Gaza, escorting buses of Palestinians to work in Israel. So, for simple reasons of self-defense and self-preservation, roadblocks came up, the barrier came up. We took measures of self-defense, some of them aggressive, most of them defensive. And yet, when I'm talking about criticism of Israel, and talking about the distortion of facts, I read this week in, I think it was Joshua Pundit. The targeted killings of terrorists, which every nation today commits, was called extrajudicial killings. We were assassinating people. The Palestinians are humiliated at the checkpoints. The military actions were always excessive force. It didn't matter what we did, it was excessive force. This twisting of the realities. This is not criticism of Israel. This is applying a different standard to the state of Israel and to the Jewish people. These are the problems that Israel has to deal with. This is where you do not have freedom of speech and academic freedom. Because you cannot come and discuss this in any international forum without being what happens today. Now we're being boycotted. Israel is always questioned. Then you have the conspiracy theories, all the old type of anti-Semitism. Just, oh, the moment you criticize Israel, oh, you're claiming that we're anti-Semitic. We always use that trump card. No. The European Commission on Xenophobia, the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia, they determined exactly when it was a legitimate criticism and when it translates into anti-Semitism. And one of these things, the Jewish conspiracy, the Jewish lobby, it's always sent in our direction, even by Jewish foes. If you want to think about something, pay attention to how suddenly, now that Mitt Romney is probably the candidate for the Republicans for the presidency of the United States, suddenly his relationship, and look how they placed it in this very sinister way, his relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu. You know, it's not enough that Benjamin Netanyahu is an Israeli, he's Jewish, and the worst thing is he's Benjamin Netanyahu. That is unforgivable. And he has a very close relationship with Mitt Romney. This insinuation, the innuendo, is also the part of the delegitimization of Israel. This delegitimization marks a concerted effort to virtually re-ghettoize the Jewish people. Just as the ghetto sought to confine and condemn Jews in the past, modern assaults on the right to raise Israeli narrative is racial segregation. The ethnic cleansing of the Jewish narrative from the international debate on the Middle East. This policy of reincarnating age-old discriminatory policies and blood libels is meant to sideline and even silence the Israeli viewpoint and the Jewish narrative. I have a few minutes. I just want to end with this. There's nothing new in what we're facing, and we have to remember that. Looking back through the history books, and I heard this from Irvin Kotler, who at the Knesset a few weeks ago spoke about the fact that was happened in the 70s, and it happened in the 60s before the occupation. It happened in 1945. The Arab League began its policy of boycotts against the Jewish entity in the land of Israel. And they picked it up after 48. There was nothing new in this. It's just a new regurgitation. I wasn't there at the time. I'm just giving you things that I studied. It was there for 2,000 years. Jews had to go with the yellow star. Was not an invention of the Nazis. They just perfected it. So Jews were always singled out. There's nothing new in this. The problem are not our detractors. The problem are us ourselves. If we think that we have any new golden calf, in the past it was the peace process. Now, since these things had failed to produce the so believed or desired peace, and I'm not condemning it in any way, instead of looking back at maybe it's not us, maybe it is not about us, maybe somebody should put pressure on the other side. It takes two to tango. And if we look at it that way and understand that pressure has to be applied also to the other side, instead of only looking at the fault and the side of Israel, maybe there's a chance for peace. I will end with one simple thing. And I bring this because the new golden idol is the accusation that the settlements are the block for peace today. Absolute nonsense. People say that you cannot defend the state of Israel, you cannot defend the policy. Yes, you can. The problem is not the people who we have to speak to. It's our own ability to do so. And in this case, defending the case for Israel, the state of Israel, on all branches, has failed continuously for the past 64 years. And ending with one simple story. My grandfather, 100 years ago exactly, came to the state of Israel. He was an Afghan Jew. He was religious. He was not a socialist. He was not a reformist. He was not a Jabotinskiist. He was a Jew who believed that finally Jews were returning to the land of Israel. He did not know what Tel Aviv was. He had no idea what Haifa was. To him, the land of Israel was Hebron and Bethlehem and Shiloh and all the locations that for 2,000 years kept us as a people. And I mention this because it is not a political issue. It is the essence of our being. Without our right to the land of Israel, we have no right to the state of Israel. And people are trying to deny that link today. And we should not be the ones assisting them in doing so. We should not be the ones giving. We should take care of what is our own best interest first, and not what is in the interest of the Palestinians. We've lost that edge. For many years, we were dealers and merchants, and we used to do what is in our own best interest. We have to go back to doing that. Thank you.